Good evening. Thanks for joining IIM members, non-IIM members. I'm Ravi V. Raghavan from the MADRAS chapter. I'm the president of the chapter. So welcome once again to the session. As you all know, IIM MADRAS chapter is a very active chapter with a lot of activities around. And one of the sessions is this session by Harish, Venkataraman on SAP and T codes, which is a hot topic today with a lot of ERPs and questions, and auditing through ERP has become very critical. And just small introduction on IIM Madras, around for about 30 years, since 1977. We have about 500, 600 members. And right across, we have a big event coming up on 3rd and 4th March, which is our national conference in Chennai. This is in Crown Plaza. Welcome to the session. And basically this session, okay, I'll come back to the main session. I don't want to steal too much of time from Harish. Harish is a manager with the Deloitte practice, risk advisory. He's a rank holder as well with a lot of experience on SAP, and he's a chartered accountant, CISA, with varied experiences. And he's an international trained person as well, works with global clients and quite well versatile on SAP and SAP HANA. So, and one request, we will have the questions right at the end. If you have any questions, you can put it on chat. I'll have Harish to answer as it happens. So just bear with us, the questions on chat. Unless we want to come to the end, everybody wants to talk, we'll have all the questions in. It's going to be a 2-hour session. If you have more questions, case studies, etc., you can put it offline. I'll have Saravanan, who's my backend team, IIM Madras, to help you out if you have more questions than 2 hours. Just a small brief about the session. Today, the session will have a basic introduction on SAP, what are the concepts, etc. Then a few minutes on the trends, what are the key critical T codes, which is the main aspect of the session. And then how is it linked to the business process? T codes are not by itself. You have ITGC, IT computer controls, SAP access controls, but the critical part is the business process control. So Harish will be going through those sessions with all the links to the key critical codes. This is a limit of time because normally we do the sessions over 3 days. We're trying to just do a sprint session. So if we need a longer session, we'll have a separate session for it. It's a 3 to 4 day sessions. And then what are the key access issues, key risks in some of these use of the T codes, how the reports are run. He has some small clippings also to screenshots to go through. And finally, SAP S4 HANA also he will touch upon because that's slightly a different version and how that works. And he will explain with a lot of examples so that the action becomes very interactive. So any questions, feel free to put it on chat. I have Varsha also. Thanks, Varsha, for joining, and I have Saravanan from the backend support. So over to you, Harish.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for your nice introduction, and good evening to all the participants. Let me share my screen. Great. Okay. So as Ravi sir has put it, right, so audit through SAP. What we'll be looking at for today is objective is 4-fold or 5-fold. While we try to understand the overview of SAP, just at a very high level on what is SAP and what are the various modules in SAP at a very high level, quickly running through. We will also be coming across very key transaction codes that are related to configurations and what are basically our security audits in SAP. And how these critical transaction codes that are relating to our security audits is going to help us across various business process cycles, right from your procure to pay, order to cash, fixed assets, or financial reporting process. Now, we are trying to link all of these controls, all of these critical transaction codes that are relevant for our audit into our business process, because while we say that these critical transaction code, right, these could be some audit related transaction code or audit logging, right? We will go through that in detail while we try to link it back to our business process, because the T codes for business process would vary from each process to process, right? The procure to pay could have different set of transaction codes. Fixed assets is an entirely different module, which could have a different set of transaction codes, and so is for the financial reporting and closure process. And while we run through all of these, we will also look into some critical accesses in SAP as what could go wrong. While we also look into audit through SAP, we will also touch at a very high level again on audit of SAP and what are the key changes or key, critical key changes between ECC and HANA that we should all embrace and appreciate the difference between auditing in an ECC environment vis-a-vis the auditing in the S4 HANA environment, right? This is the overall objective. And now let's quickly go through the overview of SAP while we go through. Now, as we all know that SAP is an enterprise resource planning ERP system that's packaged business software. And the core, the functionality of SAP, how it differs from the other systems is that because of its sheer complexity and its magnitude, it renders the needs and the necessities of users from various departments and various sectors, be it from manufacturing or be it your consumer services. So SAP is facilitated to incorporate or accommodate the needs of the users across different sectors. Now in SAP, we have different modules, right from financial module or cost and controlling module, which we will discuss in the upcoming slides as to what are the different key modules. So the modules are split up into different various segments on financials, operations, human resource, and also the corporate services for time and expenses and employee health services as well. Now, a quick anecdote of quick, thing on SAP. So SAP was initially called it's a German-based company which was founded way back in 1972, and it was called SAP EC, and now it's AGN. It was earlier called as Systems Analysis Program Development, right? So there is more to SAP than the application itself, because the SAP is differing from its other systems of, say, for example, you want to take Oracle or any other application, any other ERP format. The SAP, we will go through what fundamentally is different in SAP, right from the program. Yeah. And as we were talking about the journey of SAP, right back from 1979. It was a two-tier architecture through 1992, when a three-tier architecture, wherein the application and the database layer was separate. Well, it became essentially a three-tier architecture. And in 2004, with the advent of internet and with the advent of large amount of data, SAP went on to an ERP system, which was basically a service-oriented architecture with NetWeaver coming into place and all of these analytics coming into place. And that was SAP's journey until 2004. But in 2005, something radical happened, wherein SAP brought in SAP S4, which is the fourth generation of SAP, which pretty much we will look also what, on a very high level, we will look at what is the key difference between SAP S4 and ECC in the upcoming slide as well, which is predominantly got to do with the in-memory computing that SAP S4 was brought in, right? So what are they looking at the key modules in SAP? As we were talking about, the core and fundamental of SAP is your financial FICO module, is what we normally call. And it's been harmonized in SAP S4 into financial accounting and controlling has been brought together. And this module, FI module, is primarily used to manage your financial transactions and general ledger. And your controlling is more sort of to do with your cost and profitability of your various business processes, wherein your cost center comes into your picture, and WBS as well. Another critical module is on the sales and distribution and material management, which is used for all of our processes in relation to our sales and also our inventory and procurement model. So the one thing that we must appreciate as we look across the different modules is the terminology or the grouping under which SAP happens, or SAP structure happens. So in FI module, right, normally it is called as a company code, right? Every company would be, say, for example, I have 4 or 5 different subsidiaries entities into SAP, and logically splitting that, and FI module goes by terminology or grouping of company code, whereas in sales and distribution, it goes by distribution channels, and in purchasing, or the material manager goes by purchasing organization. So these are various terminologies that you might have come across, right, also in your earlier experience. So these are some things that we should appreciate from module by module, because although the transactions happens within SAP, considering that it has various different modules, right? The grouping, or the way that a transaction occurs could be significantly vary between one module to the how the entry in a particular module is getting transferred to a FI module, right? I could purchase an asset which should come under my asset management module, but how that is going to be interlinked to my FI module, right? All of these are something that SAP has taken care, and some of which can be customized. We will also look into at what can be customized as we go along the different ones. And the other modules are production planning, which is to do with our, in case of manufacturing industries, so right from our material requirement, MRP, capacity planning, and production order management, and which also includes, how much I should produce and all of these. And quality management is for inspection control. I can configure SAP to with various input and quality parameters. Only when all of these quality parameters are satisfied, the goods will be inverted and all of the delivery also would happen in subsequent phases. And plant maintenance and human capital management are also a couple of other modules that are there. In addition to these, there are also other modules like treasury, asset management, for which we will also look at certain controls as we go along. Right. Having talked about SAP ECC, what differs from ECC to S4 is the HANA database, as we were talking about earlier also, right? Now, this HANA database is an in-memory computing, as we were talking about. What happens is that, the data that is stored in this HANA database is compressed. We will look at how this happens. This is the overall technology environment, right? From your hardware to your operating system that is supported by ECC. And whereas on the one hand that ECC supports Oracle database, HANA, even to an extent HANA database and the other databases, whereas on the other hand, S4 runs only on the HANA database and on the HANA database and the Unix Linux systems as your operating system, right? This is an overall picture of how the journey progresses of an organization from SAP ECC into HANA, wherein, in 2011, it all came up where the HANA database was launched for the business warehouses, and then slowly ECC also started to migrate into HANA. And once ECC came on HANA, then the S4 migration was happening. And the end support, the support of SAP ECC ends somewhere in 2025. And we still have a couple of more years for organizations to adopt into SAP S4, right? So this is pretty much on the overview of SAP. When we normally talk about an SAP and various different modules, we should appreciate and understand what are the different transaction codes that, as an auditor, that you would find certain useful. I'm just going to run through 2 or 3 useful transaction codes here that are predominantly is going to drive the way that SAP is functioning, right from its configuration. So how does an organization customize or configure certain requirements of their business requirements in SAP, right? So that is something that we will look at, and also what is going to help us from the audit log or audit perspective in itself, right? And before that, while we are looking at various automations in SAP, and this is at a very high level, this is a quick slide that would talk about the controls that potentially could be automated in SAP. While SAP offers the various customizations from organization to organization, there are about 60% of the controls that can still be automated in SAP. Either the automation could happen either through standard features or the management, depending on their various business needs and unique business processes, could go ahead and customize certain requirements or certain business requirements and automate. But at a very basic level, just by adopting the SAP standard functionalities, about 60% of the normal risks and controls that we look at could be automated in SAP. Out of these 60%, there are about 39 to 40% could fall across your the procure to pay process, including your fixed assets and other things, and whereas there are about 30% of your controls could be automated in the total processing of the sales and distribution module, right? As you can see here, 21% of the total controls that we normally scope in as part of our audit, that could be automated just by adopting the standard functionalities or standard features in SAP. What this does to an internal auditor is, one is the management could already be using certain standard transaction codes, standard functionalities, whereas we could not have enabled certain automations, certain approval workflows, but we still could be adopting some manual transactions or manual approvals prior to, performing posting the final entry in SAP. So it becomes very important, even from the internal audit perspective, that we understand and appreciate where the automations could occur in SAP. And from that, we progress. So all these understandings would come in when we go through the SAP's IMG, the image customization reference, which we'll be going through in the upcoming slides as that is one of the more core configuration T code that normally the organization use to probably customize the various operations in SAP, right? Now, how does a transaction work? Before even we jump into the automation or how could I understand? But we should first understand how a transaction is recorded, right? We might have seen the SAP from its front end, wherein the users navigate to say FB01 to post any document, accounting document. And using that transaction code, people could enter a document for along with its basic details on date, your company code, your value, and other things. But how exactly it happens at the back end? So once the user enters the transaction, and every transaction code in SAP is mapped to something called as a program, right? So the program is nothing but the source code. So every transaction code will have a compiled program in SAP, which is bundled. And just to facilitate user friendliness, SAP has come up with something called a concept of transaction code, which enforces or enhances your security measures also that you can push in place. So once the user, as a user, you enter a transaction code, and this transaction will trigger your source code, and it will call the ABAP. Now, ABAP is the programming language of SAP. And once this transaction, or once this program is triggered, right, this program will run the logic basis your transaction that you have entered, and it will update the database tables. And this database table, earlier in other systems, right, we normally access the database, or we see what are the tables is there in a particular database by logging into the respective SQL database, or by the Oracle database. But here in SAP, there is a front-end option in SAP wherein there is a specific transaction code called SE16, which is at the bottom right, or as you can see. This SE16 transaction code helps a user to navigate into the table, see what are the different database tables that are there. And this is how the entire transaction works, right from the way that, the user enters a transaction till the time that, the tables are being updated, and the users can also view this through the backend table, right? Right. Now, we were talking earlier also about certain configurations, right? Where we were referring to the customizing implementation guide, which is normally the IMG, what is normally called. So there is this transaction code, which is the fundamental and core, which even as an auditor that we could get a display only access to view the various configuration in SAP is the T code SPRO. So what this T code does here is it provides you with access to various configuration settings across different modules. It is split across different modules. As you can see on the right, this is how the SAP SPRO looks like. You have materials management, quality management, plant production planning, and all of these. So these transaction codes, once you enter into this SPRO and you have, say, for example, you would want to configure, we will be looking at certain business P2P three-way matching control also later. So if you want to configure some tolerances, say you don't want your invoice price to vary with your ordered price, then you can go into this SPRO. This is where the exact configuration happens. You can go into this and then specify in the specific module, which we will cover in the later slides. You can go into that respective module and then enable that, 0 is my tolerance. And therefore, whenever the SAP functions, the SAP is configured to look into the customizations and look into the configurations from the SPRO. So what is configured in SPRO will be the one that, SAP will function basis that. Now, normally these configurations are being done by your administrators and IT administrators and basis consultants. Now, as an auditor, it is very much essential that we also get an access to the SPRO transaction code, at least for a display only. So there are various access levels in SAP, right from creating a transaction, which normally we call as an activity 01, or changing a transaction, which we call as an activity 02. And thirdly is a display only access, which is activity 03. So it is recommended that as an auditor, we get access to this SPRO with the display only access. Why display only access? We would not be able to change any of the system configuration. It's absolutely harmless to have this access. So it is very much important that we understand that the configurations that are driving SAP is done through SPRO at a very high level. All of these are standard SAP features that are configured in here. Right. And the next one is, as we discussed on SE16. So SE16 is the table, is the transaction code that provides the table update access. And this T code of SE16 is, say, for example, you would want to list down all of your sales register for a particular month. And instead of, you going to the backend, as an auditor, you would want some data that would provide you a complete data, right? Instead of searching for custom transaction code, right? SE16 provides you with an access to download the entire dump of data, entire download of the master data. Right? The only critical thing here that we should understand is that we should be aware of the table that contains the data. And obviously, we all have Google, and also now ChatGPT is there. Now, this provides us, what this normally provides us with an insight into what table name. Say, for example, you want to go into the accounting documents to see what are the different accounting documents that are posted, and that can be viewed through one of the tables called BKPF. Right? This is that table in SAP ECC, and which is replaced with a table called ACDOCA, which is accounting documents, right, in SAP S4. And all of these table names can be entered into, and as you can see, the parameters are similar, very similar to the one that we normally enter in the front end. Right? What is the company code? What is the document number? Or what is the financial year that you want to extract, document type? All of this. Once you key this in, you will be able to list down all of the transactions, including all the custom master tables and the columns that are there and available in SAP. This is one of the very handy transaction code that we should be aware of, the transaction code on SE16, which should provide you with an access to all of the data in SAP, and essentially you will be able to download it as an Excel, CSV format, or HTML or anything, right? So this is the source data under which the SAP system itself. This is the master table, master data, and transaction data. And another useful transaction code is the audit logging transaction code, right? So normally when we do an audit, we always start looking at certain transaction codes on audit logging. So SCU3 is one such transaction code that will provide you with all the change logs that has happened to a particular table. Say, for example, you would want to know how many changes has happened to, say, opening and posting periods, right? Now my SAP is configured with the period for February is open, and I will not be able to post any entries for the month of March or for the month of January, because January has not been open. But sometimes what has happened is the administrators inadvertently opened the January period today and trying to process some entry. So what you could do is, as an auditor, you could go into this SCU3 table and evaluate for that particular table. You can see what are the changes that has happened to that particular table, and when it was open, who has done it, and what are the changes to this. So this is one of the useful transaction code, but I'm going to put a caveat here. This transaction code will provide you with the tables only when they are enabled for logging. Right on the top in the first screenshot, you can see that there are a list of logged tables. So only when a table is enabled for logging, you will be able to use this particular transaction code. Right. So as you can see, that this transaction code enables you with auditing the changes, whatever changes has happened, and also ensure that the changes are in line with your particular your organization's policy, and you can also reverse any changes by restoring a previous version from the change log. Right. So this is a very good oversight tool or oversight transaction code that we regularly can use. Again, there is no harm in obtaining access to this transaction code. As an internal auditor, you can also get access to this to view the list of changes that has happening. Right. Now, moving on, right? Audit through SAP. I've just given a couple of 2 or 3 very important transaction codes as an eye-opener, right? SAP itself is a topic where we have to discuss. But what we will do is, through the next process where we are going to discuss about procure to pay process, we will discuss how do we incorporate this one into these T codes, use these transaction codes into our procure to pay process. But normally a procure to pay process starts from me raising, from the organization raising a purchase requisition or purchase order to the customer, and then
Harish, just 2 minutes. Just can you look at the chat question? Is it relevant now, or you want to answer that later?
Is there a possibility of database was not updated when transactions processed too? I think there is not a possibility where a database will not be updated when a transaction was processed. I think to answer that question, that is not possible. So whatever transaction happens, it will definitely go into the database. And what T codes or tables can be checked for logs. And tables can be checked for logs. So there is an option in SAP through SCU3, as we discussed now. There is an option in SAP where you can see all the logs, where there you have to specify which table log that you want to see. If you want to see period open, close, which periods have been opened, or what changes have happened to your documents, then you have to input that particular table and then see what are the logs for that. So it depends on the table that you want to see. One is, as I said before, that it should be enabled. The first prior dependency is that that table should be enabled for logging. Right. I hope that answers the question. Right. Now coming back to audit through SAP, right, on procure to pay process, we will understand on right from your raising a purchase order through your transaction code ME21 till the time that we make the payment, or we disperse the payment to the vendor to transaction code F110. Right, how do we use these? And let us quickly run through how I know for different procurement PO process. Right, let us quickly run through what are the steps that are involved. Right, in a normal purchase order scenario, whenever we're purchasing stock in bulk or whenever it is required, which is basically a standard PO, right? The first step is creating of PO, which is through ME21 or ME21N. And once you purchase the order, I'm not going into this phase of raising a quotation, analyzing the vendor, choosing the vendor, doing a purchase requisition, and then all those are internal documents. So the purchase order is the only document that goes to the external party, which is your vendor. And once we have the purchase order created through transaction code ME21, which here it goes through something called a release strategy, basis your approval, right? Which is again configured through your SPRO. Right, whenever you raise a purchase order, to whom should it go for approvals? Right, once you create a purchase order, the next process is, as we all know, is the goods receipt, which occurs through your transaction code MIGO, M-I-G-O, and your invoice receipt through MIRO. And once the goods and invoices is done, we verify the material stock, which is updated through the material report of MB5B. And in case if it is required for consumption, we issue the goods for consumption through transaction code MB1A. Again, for us to verify whether the goods issues has been consumed or reduced from our inventory, we can use the material report of MB5B to verify that. And finally comes the vendor payment, which is done through the transaction code F110 or F-53. Now, as an auditor, we would not be ideally expected to look into or perform these transactions at business level. But rather what we should understand is that these are the transaction code using which we could simulate a transaction for our audit purposes as such. Now, I just want to pass on one message here on the usage of ME21. So for any transaction code that comes with 21 or something, right? Even for purchase requisition transactions. So ME21 is a transaction that we normally use to create any document, in this case, a purchase order document. ME22 is going to be the one that we normally use to change any document. So 21 stands for create, which also correlates with our general SAP understanding. 1 stands for create, 2 stands for change, and 3 stands for display. Right. So same way here, purchase order creation, ME21 stands for creation, 22 will stand for modification of the existing purchase orders, and ME23 will stand for display purchase orders only. And ME21 and 21N are nothing much, it is pretty much the same. You can use either of the transaction codes, or ME23 or 23N, to either of the transaction codes to view any of the purchase orders, right? And this is just a step reduced, a couple of steps reduced in case of a CapEx, wherein we consume procure the AUC asset under construction as an expenditure. We create a purchase order, do the goods receipt, do the invoice, and then the payment. The same thing goes. I'm just going to quickly run through this. It's just a slide that that is trying to detail on the different processes that are involved in each of the different PO scenarios, right? But let us also look at what are the key controls in these processes. What as an auditor that we could use, how could we use certain transaction codes to audit these specific controls around the risks or address the risks around the P2P process, right? One such control, the first very important control that anytime that we take a P2P process is, the first one is a three-way matching control, right? Wherein we compare our PO to your goods receipt and then to your invoice and see if all these are in conformance, and if not, what the system does. So we will look into how do we go about in such cases, or what are the transaction codes that we can use in each of these scenarios. And second control is the account determination, right? How do we, the moment a GR/IR happens or a purchasing price variance entry happens, so how is that creating a journal entry? So although this might seem like, the moment you go post it, a journal entry is created, right? It doesn't seem much complicated, but there is a lot more to do it in relation to the configuration of SAP. And lastly, is on the material valuation, and again, the account determination. How is this determined? And the last one is on the disbursement cycle. How does SAP perform that, and how is the entry being posted? Let us look at each of these example or model controls that are there, right? And first taking the SAP three-way matching.
Harish, there are 2-3 questions. Can you answer that?
Sure. And the FICO module for financial accounting generated SAP finance systems, financial statement like that of balance sheet and P&L and other relevant to audit preliminary subject to audit changes. I think yes, you will be able to generate it. It's a routine process where we can generate the SAP systems reports on other general ledger pertaining to. So normally the FI and CO module, sometimes organizations use certain specific nomenclatures or number ranges for a GL account, right? Certain GL accounts could start with certain series that's depending on the organization's number series configuration, right? Any numbers, any general ledger that starts with 1 or 2 or 3, right? So likewise, you can generate your balances, your trial balance for the specific GL account, which is going to be under your FI and CO module, and that is very much possible. After the books of accounts have been closed in SAP, FI, CO, by the finance and accounts department for submitting to audit, can the FICO generate a system generated? Yes, you can generate. And again, if there is also a possibility that the books of accounts can be reopened, for which we were also discussing the logs on which we have to also be taking care of. Is the T codes different for CO module? No, not necessarily. It depends on the transaction. So the transactions are happening in the SAP. So the T codes, yes, there are some unique transaction codes for CO, like the transaction code specific to your cost center or WBS. So for each of that project management, project center, I think there are specific transaction codes, but predominantly from the audit perspective, it is pretty much going to be the same. Right. Now coming back to, I think I've answered the open ones in the Q&A, right? Now coming back to the three-way matching, right? So as we all might be aware of this entire process of three-way matching, let me not brush it back to you for the sake of time, right? What could potentially go wrong, right? I'm having a purchase order for, say, for example, for 100 rupees, and I'm having a goods 100 rupees. I've ordered 10 quantities, each of rupees 10. I'm receiving, say, 9 quantities for 110 rupees or 108 rupees or 12 rupees per quantity. Now, how do you think the system should accept this? Because one is, or I would put another way, 9 quantities has been purchased for 99 rupees, which is well within my overall purchase order value of 100. But individually, if I do, there is a difference of rupees from 10 rupees to 11 rupees, right? How is the system going to treat all of these variances? This is where SAP in customization, so IMG customizing, whatever we have seen through SPRO transaction code, there is an option where we can establish what is our tolerance thresholds, right? As we understood earlier, any transaction that is stored through the front end transaction code will always reside in my backend tables, right? Any configuration, for the matter of fact, which is done through SPRO, either you can navigate through the GUI and then go into the respective module, take screenshots or look into what configurations are there. Either we can do that way, or if we very well know the table, or by Googling out, we identify the table that stores pretty much the same information that is configured, right? That is also possible by navigating to the transaction code of SE16. Now, the first thing that we should understand in such a control is what is the configured thresholds. Now, in SAP, all of these, thresholds, all of these analysis or variance, right? The variance between my purchase order price to my invoice price, or the variance between my PO quantity to my goods receipt quantity, or the invoice quantity to my goods receipt quantity. All of these are various analysis that SAP does, and for each of these analysis, the organization can configure the tolerance. Sometimes I might have my price tolerance, but I will not have a quantity tolerance. Or I might have quantity tolerance because of some natural degradation process. The moment I receive it, I can have a 2% quantity tolerance, but I will not have a price tolerance, right? So these are various customizing options that SAP has, and all of this can be viewed in the table called T169G. Although all these might sound Greek and Latin in case you have not done already, but this is because SAP has its own unique way of naming all of these tables, right? Any configuration tables and other transactional tables. So T169G is a table that is normally used to store all of these transactions on all of these variants and thresholds. And once, say for example, I'm processing an invoice. I'm processing an invoice with 11 rupees for 9 products and 99 rupees against my ordered price of 90 rupees, proportionate ordered price of 90 rupees. Now there is a difference of 9 rupees or 10%, right? Now my configured value is only 5% variance. And now what happens, what the system does is it'll go for a block state, right? The block state, as in, there are two ways again the system can be configured. Now, this is the depth of the configurations that is possible in SAP, right? Either I can allow the system to process it and then the transaction goes for a blocked state, or I can ensure that the system, the entry cannot itself happen. I can block the status, or I can prohibit the user from even entering that entry whenever it is, not in conformance with my configured threshold. So all these options are possible in SAP, right? How do we release that? Say, for example, once the entry is posted in SAP, how do we release it, right? That is done through the transaction code called MRBR. So whenever an entry is getting blocked, right, and once you navigate into transaction code MRBR, this facilitates that, this enables the document to be released for payment. Now, what risk that we could foresee here is, if a same person is doing both of these activities that he's posting, say, for example, I know the particular vendor, and through him, I'm just colliding with the vendor. I'm trying to process an invoice here, right? I'm trying to process an invoice for 10 quantities at, say, 10,000 rupees instead of ordered price of 100. And the invoice goes for a block. And I also have access to the transaction code of MRBR. I'm going into the transaction code. I'm clicking on release the transaction. I'm removing the block, and automatically the payment cycle that is configured in SAP will eventually take this invoice for payment, right? So we should also consider these access and SOD related risks that is possible in this, and which is very well, we should appreciate as part of our audit process. And there have been various tools that are emerging, right from your continuous control monitoring or other analytics tool that on a periodical basis or a daily basis that throws out such outliers and other things. So which also is being used by the organizations extensively as we speak, right? These tolerances again can be configured in both percentage and value. Either it could say 5%, 2%, or say you should not exceed 100 rupees, or it should not exceed 1,000 rupees, or $10 or $50. So that both of these configurations are possible. And this is how the transaction code also looks like, right? This is how the transaction code looks like, right? Where you can go into the tolerance, see the tolerance key. And these are all of the list of all the standard tolerance keys that are available, right? The tolerance key could be for quantity variance, tolerance key could be for price variance, tolerance key could also be for moving average price variance. Say, for example, until now, a material has been valued at, say, so X price, 10 rupees. Because of some erroneous purchase, my material value price increases to 1,000. Right, then that also can be configured. And all of these are, what is the maximum cash discounts in percentages allowed? Right, all of these are very much possible to extract. And there is also one question: is there any SAP report that can give details whether the user has actually used MRBR transaction code or other transaction code? Yes, there is an SAP report that will give you whether a particular user has accessed the transaction code, but what he has posted through it is again another transaction code, that is another audit tool. So as we said again, right, SAP is very complex in the way that it has been designed, but it also has a lot of features and a lot of logs that are enabled that facilitates our other forensics and audit purpose. Now, as you see on the right, that is also another model example of the screenshot, how that is there. Although this is in a bit of a unformatted one, but I think the later versions of the GUI facilitates us to easier understanding. So these are the various tolerance keys that we should be aware of in case of when we are looking at the three-way match. And one of the most critical table is T169G, the transaction code SE16 that stores all of these relevant configurations. Right, now moving on to the next one on GR, right? Now, what happens is, as we were discussing, right, this company code concept is very much applicable in my FICO module. And all of these company codes will again have something called the chart of accounts. So which company code follows which chart of account? Chart of account is a unique terminology again used in relation to your account assignments for the purpose of determining, in case I'm posting some entry, right? It could be even a GR entry. Why I am receiving a good. Now, where should my entry go? To which GL account should my entry go? Although this sounds very easy, but it is very much important that we understand that, this basic hardening or this basic configuration is correctly configured in place. The entries are desired to go to the right general ledger account only and not to some other account, right? And the configuration of SAP and the company code to your chart of accounts is done ideally through the transaction code OB62. But again, you can view it from the very first table of SAP, which is SAP T0001, and this is the table that stores your company code to your chart of account mapping. Right. And once this mapping happens, the second subsequent mapping will be to your chart of account to your account determination. Account determination is a concept in SAP that will determine for which event, when I'm processing a GR, for which event, what is the from GL account and to GL account. Say, for example, I'm receiving any money through a bank, then again, that follows an account determination. Or you are making GR, or you're posting any invoice to any clearing account for the matter, then that has its own account determination. So account determinations can be configured for various events or transactions that happen in SAP, right? And this is how the assignment looks like. Table T001, as you can see, this particular company 003, which is a test company, is mapped to the chart of account called CAUS. And these are the various other five different company codes that are mapped to the same chart of accounts. Now, these chart of accounts will in turn be mapped to your GL accounts, right? As you can see here, this chart of account, this is the back sample. I think chart of account will be here, CAUS. That is mapped to my transaction type of BSX, which is again mapped to my GL account of 12300. So this is how you should read a configuration, and for any difference, or this is how the SAP works, right? This is one of the most important table that we should understand prior to we carrying out any audits in SAP, right?
Excuse me, sir. One open question is there.
Yeah, I think I have answered that. Let me just respond to that. I have answered that because the question was around whether the user has actually used MRBR transaction code. And yes, it is possible. We will discuss what transaction code will provide you in the upcoming slide, but that is possible. There's a transaction code called SM20 that will facilitate the users in reviewing what all transaction codes that he has accessed when he has logged in, logged out, and all of this, right? And the next area of control that we would quickly want to look at is the material valuation. As we all know, right, material valuation, again, COGS entry becomes a very fundamental and very important entry, and how this account determination is also configured, which is similar to the one that we have earlier looked into for account determination. But material valuation, right, we all know that there are widely two accepted configurations in SAP. One is a standard price and a moving average price, right? And this price control is what normally is referred to in SAP. And whenever the price control refers to as S, it is standard. And whenever it is referred to as V, it's a moving average price. And this configuration, whether a particular material, today I'm procuring a raw material, whether a particular material is valued at a standard cost or a moving average is done through the transaction code called MM01. We must, however, note that once it is created, once a material is created with a transaction code, then it is not possible to change the valuation type or the price control directly through MM01 again or MM02. There is another transaction code called MR21. That is the transaction code that normally is being used to update the cost and price controls. And all of these materials, say, so for example, as part of the internal audit, you want to verify whether all of the materials have been configured with appropriate price controls or not. Sometimes the finished goods, organizations might have a practice of valuing your finished goods by standard cost and raw materials by your moving average cost. Then whether all of your materials follow the appropriate price control. So how do we do that is, again, going to the table. There is one particular table called MBEW that provides you with all the list of materials along with their price control and their corresponding quantity and valuation as on the particular date that we gain. Right? That is very much possible to be. And once we have that, once we look into that, we will be able to identify this particular material belonging to the group of finished goods or the group of raw material or a group of stores or work in progress material, right? It could be some petty things that it could be a spanner or a tool that we are using as part of the spares, right? It could be any of that grouping. So what grouping or what is the valuation method used for that particular material? So that is very much possible to analyze using the table MBEW. And we can very much again go back and recalculate the weighted average cost that has been computed by the system, right? And whenever the transactions undergo a change, say from today, I change one valuation of one particular material from moving average price to standard price or vice versa, what happens in SAP is again, this generates a log. And this log can be directly viewed in MM04 itself rather than we going to the table logging as we discussed earlier. This is very much possible to view through the transaction code of MM04. Once we go into there, once we specify which material you want, you can list down all of the material changes to the particular document, right? Again, we discussed on the chart of accounts earlier as well. And this is how the configuration looks like. Say, for example, there is a material on so-and-so plant, and the material can be configured with a standard price or a moving average price, which is S or a V. And the valuation account determination method will again be the same as to how we have discussed earlier. So once we get a comfort as an internal auditor, you should understand that you do an analysis of all of these to tie back your system configurations in place and ensure that the cost computation or the entries, the COGS entry is being posted to the right account is appropriate or not, right? And what happens is the next point, the last point that I would probably wanted to discuss in the procure to pay process is the disbursement cycle. So these are certain transactional T codes, right? The T codes that are used to initiate a disbursement cycle, right? From F110, which is an automatic payment program that is used to generate, payment proposals. I can generate the payment runs, I can generate the payment proposals, and also I can choose which payment method and what day for which vendors that I want to pay. So all of these are facilitated through the transaction code F110. And FBZP is again the payment program configuration, wherein we define the payment program by your methods, your house banks, and what is the payment method that you want to use. And once the payment is done, we normally go back to the FBL1N, which is nothing but your vendor GLs to see whether the invoices and payments for that particular vendor has been accounted for properly. And FBZ0 is the payment proposal transaction code, which also is in line with our F110. And finally, display check information in case we're using is also used to display. So these are the various controls in disbursement cycle. Again, one such possibility from the audit perspective or the SAP perspective is that we can customize, we can ensure that anytime approval or anytime a payment proposal is being generated in SAP, we can configure SAP to generate an accounting. We can configure SAP to generate or trigger rather the approval workflow prior to processing the payment in the bank. So earlier some organizations could use this as a manual transaction, like they could print out or they could take a print or they could download the copy, send it over to the accounting finance head whomsoever is responsible for it, and he reviews and then sends okay, and then only then the transaction could. But this very well could be automated within SAP, where these proposals could be sent for review and they itself reviewed or deselected. This, say you don't want to pay a specific vendor for so reasons, that also is possible where we can deselect a particular payment. So all of these are some things that that can be very much done through F110 transaction code by customizing through the transaction code of SPRO. Right? And this is how the F110 would look like. I'm running it on today, which is 24th February 2023. And I can choose your customers, or I can choose up to the documents that are due up to what date. And the company codes can as well be entered along with the payment methods. So this is how a normal disbursement cycle would ideally look like, right? And there are also other controls in P2P process, right? I don't want to touch much, but I'm just giving you a high-level overview, considering the time constraint as well. There's other controls include your duplicate invoice, your sensitive field changes in your vendor master. Now, what happens in a duplicate invoice is, say, for example, SAP can be configured to identify a duplicate invoice. So how does it identify a duplicate invoice? is by normally analyzing the various parameters. Say, for example, I'm posting an invoice with, say, a number as 1234 received from a vendor ABC on this date for this amount, right? All of these combinations together, if I'm trying to post it on a different date, then again, the system can be configured to throw a duplicate invoice. Again, here, there are two ways that a duplicate invoice can be worked on. Either SAP can prevent the system from posting a duplicate invoice, or they can forever prohibit the issue, rather display a warning only or an error message, right? And for to enable this, right, one is we need to set the parameters, right, at the check duplicate invoice parameters at the vendor level also, which is done, which you can very well refer to in the table LFB1. In that, there is a specific column that will say whether this vendor is enabled for duplicate check or not. Right, that becomes a very important field that we should also look at. Although the SAP might be configured to look at certain, can be configured to look at certain duplicate invoices, right? I can configure date, combination of date, vendor, and amount could be a field for your analysis. But if that vendor is not enabled for duplicate check, then I think that is something that will cause a control lapse also. So that is something that you should also take care as an internal auditor. And the reference is what is configured and documented through T003, right? So this is on the duplicate invoice, and similarly on the sensitive field changes in SAP ECC, right? In ECC, there is this, there is no longer a concept of vendor or customer in SAP S4 because it is all the business partners, which we will look at in the later slides. But in ECC, or to the matter of fact in SAP S4, that if we determine a change to be a material or a sensitive field for that particular master, say, for example, I have a vendor and vendor's bank account can be configured as a sensitive field. And whenever a change is occurring to that configured, change is occurring to that sensitive field, it always will trigger for an approval. A dual control has to be in place that will enforce and ensure that the transactions are indeed accurate and something is not inappropriate, right? So this happens through FK08 or FK05 also, and these configurations are stored. What is a sensitive field, right? That configuration is stored in the table T055F. So these are, some high-level controls and their related transaction codes that commonly are being used to this, right? I think I have. Is there any reason that there is no by default preventive control for invoice duplication for all vendors? Actually, no, because this allows for a lot of customization. So in SAP, it's all about the way that we customize the SAP, or we customize the analysis, various controls for a matter of fact, and there is no specific reason as to it. It is at the liberty of the organizations to enforce all of these configurations. Can a vendor who's an MSME be changed to as not MSME, right, without proper checks in the master? I think we discussed that in case if certain specific fields you determine that field to be a critical field, then you can configure that in SAP. You can recommend to configure that particular field as a sensitive field. So any change that happens in a future, that happens in the in future down the line, you can ensure that there are adequate checks and balances in that. And also there are transaction codes that you can use to generate what all masters have changed from what value to what value. That is also possible in SAP, right? And moving on to the next module, and let's quickly run through the fixed assets and financial reporting closure process, right? So what happens in the overview of depreciation? Now, although we are aware that the depreciation is something that is a very standard feature across this. This can be automated in SAP by configuring the assets and its useful life and various other parameters. So what happens in SAP depreciation at the back end? All of us know what happens in the front end, right? At the back end, what happens is, again, as we discussed, every company code will have a chart of account and also a chart of depreciation, because you should understand that the depreciation amount will be posted to my FICO module, whereas my assets are stored under my asset management AM module, right? So to enable that, chart of account is something that is used in your FICO, and chart of depreciation is something that pertains to your AM module. What happens here is every company code is assigned with a chart of account and chart of depreciation. what happens is whenever we are creating an asset, an assets, you can create it through your other transaction code on AS01, AS02, right? So what happens is once you create it, you have to define the depreciation key. So depreciation key is a very unique concept in SAP, wherein you will have to configure whether a particular asset is going to be a straight line or different methods, right? Returned on value, or even for a matter, some companies would have their own unique way of configuring depreciation keys basis their accounting policies that they are going to adopt. And all of these, every asset will have again be grouped into some asset class. This is for the purpose of easing out the depreciation process. So what is an asset class is nothing but it's like a furniture and fitting, or land and buildings, right? Plant and machinery, or other office equipments, right? All of these assets, individual assets, will be grouped under an asset class. And all of these assets and asset class will also be tagged to something called a depreciation key. And land and buildings, as we might know, will not ideally be tagged to a depreciation key, or it will be tagged to a zero depreciation key. Right? So as an internal auditor, what is it that we can do around this process is once the depreciation key is being assigned on a monthly basis, the moment you initiate the depreciation run, the depreciation gets posted. But as an auditor, what can we do is first we should use the transaction or table T093C to understand which chart of depreciation the company codes pertain to. And there are three tables that are very much relevant: is ANKA, ANKB, which is also another table, and ANLA and ANLB. All these four tables, what it contains is basically your assets, your asset classes, what are your assets tagged to each of your depreciation, and how is your depreciation key configured, and what is the depreciation key configuration itself, right? I might just say that this asset is tagged to a key called SLM, which is a straight line method. Just by having a key of SLM does not mean that the assets would be depreciated in the straight line method, right? So all of these can be customized through that, and we should ensure we get a download of all of this to perform our independent testing as an internal auditor to analyze how the depreciation happens. And then finally, see, again comes the account determination, right? There is a standard table, again, it's a different table for asset management, asset account determination, which is T095B. So this table will contain your accounts adjustment table, right? Determination table. So what happens in case of sale of asset? Which GL account should that account go? What happens in case of depreciation? Which GL account should my depreciation value go? All of these are stored in the table T095B, right? As you might know, these are some of the useful transaction codes also. AFAB, which is used to execute the depreciation run. And this is the fundamental of all the initiation of depreciation run itself. And AS01 and AS02 is the transaction code that is used to create or change asset master. So as an auditor, you want to see what does the asset master look like. We can navigate to a transaction code called AS03, which is nothing but an extension of your asset master, but with only a display-only access. And that will display to you all of the asset master data, including your depreciation key, useful life, and other asset information. And AB08 is used to display your depreciation postings against an asset. And AW01N is a transaction code that you can use to identify what is the current particular value of a specific asset. Right. Now, this is pretty much at a high level on the overview of depreciation. I know I'm dumping too much of transaction codes, but rather than me focusing on the T codes as such, because SAP has a whole lot of transaction codes in SAP, but rather than focusing on the SAP transaction codes, right, it is very much, we all as an internal auditor should be aware that, there exists an option in SAP which can be used to perform so-and-so activities or certain things, or this is the way that SAP functions or SAPs can be configured, right? Once we have that, I think we all have Google in our hands to probably learn more about SAP. SAP is a never-ending topic, and SAP is a never-ending subject as well. And posting periods, coming back to the next point on posting periods, right? Now, how do we do that? Now, the opening of posting periods is again done through some transaction code of OB52, which normally will determine how a transaction code of works. What should be my current period? So now today I'm in February 24. Now, I can allow, as an organization, my policy is just to allow 1 month of posting period. I might close my books every month on the fifth day of every month, right? Up to March 5, I can afford to have my accounts opened of the month of February. But how do we identify this? How do we audit this? Correct. So this T001, as we were looking earlier, is the standard table that will list down all of your posting periods that are open currently, right? In my company code today, as on date, what is the posting period that is open? And there is also something called as a fiscal year variant, which is nothing but your configuration for your particular company codes and your period open close. And T001B is the one that is going to list down all of your open posting periods, right? Now, how it happens? Let me just quickly go to the screenshot follow, right? So what happens is in a posting period, so there is something called an account type in SAP. Not all the accounts will be a general ledger account. We could have some accounts called asset type accounts, or a customer accounts, vendor accounts, materials, and also something called the general ledger account, right? And the moment we run the depreciation, say I'm taking an example of an asset type account. So the moment we run the depreciation at the end of every month, be it say 28th February or 31st March, we don't have any transaction to do with my asset type account. So therefore, the organizations could afford to close the asset type accounts in SAP at the end of every month itself. So this is one customizing option that SAP comes up with, wherein you can the period open close does not happen at an overall level. It happens for each and every account types in SAP. So every account type or a matter you want to still further customize, you can also open specific general ledgers. Instead of specifying the account type, you can specify directly the general ledger to open that. Now, what happens is, how do we identify whether, whether the periods have been opened before, when it's not supposed to be open, right? Again, this is where I would want to refer or refresh back the memory on the transaction code called SCU3 that generates the log of all such changes that we were discussing also, right? Now, once we generate that, we will be able to identify, say, for example, today is 24th February. On 24th February, if I'm trying to open a period from December, for which the quarter has already closed, and now I'm trying to process for an entry for something that the quarter reporting has already happened, right? So that is something that you can quickly catch hold of by identifying the log of changes that has happened to the open periods, and therefore you will be able to investigate further in case if it warrants any, right? But as we said again, this logging will happen only when this table, this T001B, right? The third table that is listed on the first section of the presentation here is enabled for logging. Only when the T001B is enabled, we would have the log generated, but by default, SAP enables the configurations of T001B to be logged. And we will come to this REC client settings later also. There is a parent setting. REC client is nothing but record client. This is a nomenclature used in SAP for recording of any transaction. So this has to be enabled for the table logging to happen, right? So these are certain considerations that we should draw from our entire, the posting periods perspective, right? As an auditor, we should be aware that, this is possible. And if that is possible, if opening is possible, then these are the transaction code that you should resort to see when it was opened, who opened it, and whether it followed any approval process or not. Right. And now, quickly going on to the next one on order to cash. I think there's one question there. Okay. Yeah. Moving on to the next one on the order to cash process. Now, here again, it is similar to what we discussed earlier, right? So, order to cash is nothing but right from the time that we receive a sale order, or receive a sale order until the time that we dispatch the goods and receive the money from our customers. Now, what are certain key controls that could, as an internal auditor, that we should be aware of from the SAP perspective? One is, again, account determination. Only when deliveries that have been shipped and relieved inventory are available to create materially related invoices to customers. Now, what could go wrong here? I could have an order for X material, and I should not be able to create an invoice or ship for some Y material. Right? That is something that SAP can. And then the customer credit check. This is something that is also possible. Say, for example, a customer can have a credit limit built. He can purchase a goods for about 1 lakh rupees without paying any advance or down payment, right? So that this customer credit limit can also be configured. And again, the account determinations for whenever we receive the accounts or customer reconciliation accounts are possible. Now, quickly going into the billing control and invoicing quantity and this, right? So what happens, right? So in SAP, there is again this table of VBRK that will list down all of your billing documents. Billing documents in the sense the list of invoices in SAP that are recorded. So again, here in SAP, there are two things. One is a sales document and a billing document. Although the nomenclature might sound very very much similar. A sales document is nothing but your sale order, and your billing document is your invoice that you have generated. So VBRK is a table again. So this is a table and not a transaction code. Transaction code is something that you go and directly key inside SAP, but a table is something you go inside SC16T code and enter into it. And this is the VBRK will provide you with a list of all the invoices. And if you want to look into a specific control or specific what happened to this particular delivery or what happened to this particular billing document, that can very much be accessed through VF03. And VF03 will also provide you with an entire trail, right from the order to your delivery to your the invoice that got generated. Right. While we do that, we should also the outbound delivery will happen through VL06. And one of the most important automation, I would rather say, that happens in this entire process is the copy control, right? Copy control is something of a very unique nature. What happens is, so in SAP, there is something called as a document type. So document type is nothing but what accounting document or what material document that it is. A purchasing order will be of a different document type, document type is basically capturing or helping you capture, right? Now, I think we were talking about the delivery and copy control in SAP. What this copy control does is, since the sales order is happening through a document type, and the delivery is happening through a document type, and invoicing is happening through a document type. At the time of invoicing, I should invoice only for the quantities that I have delivered. So this copy control in SAP will facilitate the copying of information from my previous source document types to my target document types, right? This copying is happening through the transaction code called VTFL, or rather the table TBCPF, that would specify various copy requirements. Right? Copying requirements will first be defined, and how this copying should affect my document posting, whether is it going to have a positive impact or a negative impact, and whether my document flow should get updated by such copying. All of these will be configured in SAP. And whenever this copying happens, should the user have access to edit the transaction or edit the data that is getting copied, right? All of these are possible to be configured in SAP. Sometimes, I could copy in the quantity, or I could copy in the price, but I will still have the option to edit the quantity at the time of billing. The organizations could still have it, right? So all of these are certain controls that we should look for in SAP. Right. This is how the TBCPF looks like, and the document flow also look like, as you may be very well aware that right from the sales order to outbound delivery to the invoice that gets generated. And this is how the configuration, although this sounds like the configuration from backend is looking like the item category, copy requirement 4, 7, positive B, right? Each of these fields means a specific definition, right? What it is better that whenever we do such analysis, we also bring in a column of their analysis, what exactly it means for each of these document types to the billing document type. So this is, rather than, we digesting all of this, but it is very much better that, we understand, the requirements that of SAP, that there exists a concept of copy control, through which a certain billing document type to the delivery document type to your order document type the data could be copied, and essentially the data could be configured in such a way that the editing is possible. As an internal auditor, we are more concerned about the integrity of the data from my original document type to the final accounting entry, the document type that is responsible for the accounting entry, right? So this is something that we should also be wary of when we are looking at the controls in order to cash process. And the next one is on the credit check, right? As we all know that customers can be configured with the credit limit check. The SAP has a wonderful feature on automatic credit control, wherein the customers are grouped and then the credit risk areas will be defined, the credit groups will be defined. As an auditor, what we need to do in case of an SAP ECC environment is first understand what are these different sales document credit control check that are configured. This can be done through the table TVAK. This table will basically essentially provide us what are the sales document types that are there and what is the credit check they are using. So this is a very plain mapping, and this mapping will again be drilled down to what is the credit area and the credit risk, and then this credit risk and the credit area will be tagged to my customer credit limits. For individual customers or the customer group, they will be mapped to this credit control check. Thereby, the customers will have a particular credit control enabled in SAP. So it is very much important that we understand the flow of the transactions that happen in SAP, the way that configurations rather happen in SAP, right? So these are the way that, this is how a normal, the older version of SAP also looks like with your credit check. But it's very much important that, we understand this configuration and also use the relevant transaction codes or use these transaction codes in sequence to understand how this particular flow of transaction has occurred in the system, right? I think there is one question. At times, user ID for few transactions is displayed as RFC user, but not the SAP user ID that processed. Okay, this could be because of the reason that in your organization, right? There could be an interface or an integration that happens between one system to another system. That is the reason that the transaction could be reflecting, even though I am initiating it. Say, for example, today I'm initiating a transaction, and then later on there is some sort of background processing that happens basis after which the transaction is getting posted. So that background processing could be done under the user ID called RFC user, or sometimes I'm going to initiate a transaction in other system and that transaction is getting posted to SAP. In that case, when all of these kind of interactions or data processing happens, SAP is very much possible, where you can go and configure certain transactions to be under a different ID, and that is the reason that maybe you may see that it is done by RFC user and not the user who had initiated the transaction. Right now, coming back to the order to cash O2C controls, and we discussed on credit limit check. I think the next one is on the account determination. Forgive me for the error there. Right, on the account determination procedures on the AR reconciliation. So as we will all be aware that the sub ledgers and the general ledgers and the customers will always have a reconciliation accounts being mapped, and that is no longer there in SAP S4 as I understand, right? This has been weed off from the SAP S4. Now, how do we, again, this is a very similar concept of account determination that we discussed. So account determination will follow for each and every module, for asset management, for procurement, for goods, and also similarly for sales order and billing also. Right? So this is also something that we should be wary of. And what is I think we have pretty much now discussed, or we have looked into certain important controls in SAP from both ECC or S4 perspective, or wherever the controls were specific to ECC, we have called it out as well. Now, we have come across these specific controls across these various processes by trying to understand the transaction codes also. But with the advent of SAP S4, and pretty much now most of the organizations have now moved into SAP S4. Now, this calls for some unique controls that are being introduced inside SAP S4, just for just because there has been an upgrade in the way that SAP S4 functions. Right. Let us go through some very high level impact on features that have been introduced in SAP S4 from the accounting perspective. Right. The very first thing is on the universal ledger, right? Universal journal, as I might put. Now, what all of these happens, or what all of these warrants, is for organizations to continually modify or enhance their risk and control matrices, because the risks or controls that you might have foreseen in an ECC environment could be different, or could vary to a significant extent, or some things could even be nullified. There are very few things that happen, and there are some new some bigger features that are also enforced in SAP S4. The first such concept is the universal journal. That is going to serve as a single source of truth for all of your accounting models or accounting components. Right. So as we were talking about earlier, we were also discussing on something on BKPF, which is an accounting document table, which is now BKPF and BSEG. So how earlier the document used to be stored in SAP is one table used to contain the header data, which is basically like who has posted an entry in which company code on what date. That is all. The header data will be stored in a table, and the transactional data, the line item data, to which GL account, what is the amount, what is the tax, and all of these amounts will be stored in a different table, which is a line item. So there always used to be a header table and line item table, but in SAP S4, this has been taken away, and we have brought into a single, all of these accounting documents have been merged together, and formed a accounting document table of ACDOCA, right? That is on the universal journal. And then second is on the appendix ledger. And this is a very much on the FI and CO modules. Although they were earlier in SAP ECC as different modules, there has been a very good integration of FI and CO, and that is something that is there. And real-time close is again the financial reporting process, and basis your real-time operations, right from your bad debts provisioning or anything that is also enhanced feature of SAP S4. And transformative business and next-gen UI and SAP Fiori, you get your mobile applications and all of these. So even though you get a mobile application, all of these might be a user experience, right? These bring up new risks and the organization as we go along. Right? These bring up some new risks in relation to the way that we are looking at certain controls in SAP, right? Because a person could initiate a transaction from his mobile or initiate a transaction from his system, laptop, and approve it on his mobile, right? This calls for an enhanced user access, which we will also discuss in the upcoming slides on various audit considerations that needs to follow. And central finance is again a separate topic on its own, and cash management again is a separate topic on its own that is being powered by SAP HANA in its new fin. CFIN has also undergone several updates even recently as we talk, and also the SFIN, the simple finance also. So these are various quick overview on various capabilities or control changes. Let us look at specific control changes that are going to happen. As we were talking about universal journal, right? Earlier there was this GL, there was this. This is how the universal journal looks like. The figure at the bottom right, right? So the universal journal will have the details from your earlier GL, your cost and profitability analysis, your CO module, your asset accounting material. All of these are coming together to form something called as a universal journal, and that is nothing but the ACDOCA that we were talking about, right? Accounting document, the table that is going to talk about, and this replaces our older table of header table, line item table, all of this, and this bundles into a single source of truth, rather than I'm going to see, okay, this is a document, who has posted this, I will be able to find it in one table. Then I'm going to a different table to find what is the value. I'm going to a different table to find what is the asset details of it. Now with the introduction of universal journal in SAP S4, with all of this are very much possible. We looked at from a single point. And the next, again, expanding on this is again the expansion on appendix ledgers, wherein as a traditional, FI and CO reconciliation is no longer needed because of the very close integration. So therefore, all of these are the older controls might not be applicable to the SAP S4 environment, and basically the RCM has to be updated in line with the process that we follow, and secondly with the technical capability of the application itself. If we have redundant control that is no longer performed by the application, then that would not make any sense to our audit as well, right? And this warrants also for including some additional control or modifying the control. One such example is automatically post the data from your general ledger and eliminate the needs for reconciliation of these accounts, right? And as we discussed, again, a real-time close is, earlier, the traditional control requirements can now be removed with this, because there is a soft closure possible, a continuous closure whenever that, that is possible in SAP S4. And CFIN, as we discussed, again, is a topic on its own. But one of the very important point that I know that I've previously touched at a very high level is on the customer and vendor master. So normally, a customer and a vendor master is something that, is configured in SAP or is available as part of any application, right? But what happens in SAP S4 is that, all of these have been merged together. That what they call as a customer vendor integration, or CVI, has now been brought together. They have been brought under a common roof, and they have been termed as a business partner, right? This transformation is again going to change the way that we look at a customer master or a vendor master, the way that we are looking at, because it is all coming under the common roof, and the controls will also, differ to the significantly to the extent of, customer and vendor. But still, the concepts of security, of changing the customer sensitive fields will also remain the same. But it is very much important that we understand that it is no longer customer vendor master, it is a business partner approach, right? BP is a single point of entry where we create or edit, or what is his relationship to this entity, whether is he going to act as a business partner, what is he a customer, is he a vendor, all those relationships can be defined. This is basically to harmonize, because some entities could be a customer as well as a vendor, right? So to eliminate all of this, it's been brought under the common roof of business partners. Now, cash management, again, this is again a separate topic on its own, wherein we have to talk about the bank account and workflows of how the master data maintenance happens for all of these. This one, and this also has been facilitated through Fiori. Now, while we have talked pretty much on what is happening through SAP of various business processes, I've dumped you with a lot of transaction codes. I'm not sure if some of you were even able to follow, right? So there are various SAPs, again, as we began by an ocean in itself. There are various transaction codes that are there in SAP for to audit. Now, while all of those are there in SAP for all of us to grab, there is also one more thing that we should appreciate is audit of SAP. Right? Audit of SAP is nothing but we looking into SAP. Again, by now we should all be aware that SAP is such a complex ERP system. It is not a simple role-based, or it's not a simple application that would just okay, I'm just sticking it here, this is done, right? It's not that way. It has so much interfaces established within itself. It has so many modules that talk to each other. There are so many transactions. There are so many unique security features that are there. Now, how do we go about it? First, it becomes essential to understand the core component, right? Now, there is something called a basis component. I'm not going to get much into it, right? And what happens is SAP configuration happens through SPRO, which we discussed, and the resultant table stores in tables. That tables are there, and it becomes so. We have seen that we can extract the data from the tables through SE16. But what if the table itself could be modified, right? That calls for additional caution over that. What all of this is providing to you is kind of an some things that can go wrong in SAP, both from the transactional perspective and also at the backend from the IT team perspective, right? Your SAP IT team could be robust enough, but what if an inadvertent change from the backend would cause a data integrity issue to our financial reporting process? All of this has to be taken into consideration, right, from its development process to its security administration, right? All of these are basically components that we should also be aware of, and we should appreciate that having SAP having so many features, it is still possible for something to go wrong, and it can go undetected also, right? This is where we are now drawing to 2 or 3 important transaction codes, right? SUIM and SM20 transaction code. Now, what happens in both of these? I'll just take these two together, right? What happens in SM20 or SM21? This also is a follow-up as we are answering another question of a participant, right? SM20 is basically the transaction code that is used for viewing the system log. So whatever transactions that has happened in the system can be viewed. This is how SAP SM20 looks like, as you can see on the right side screen, right? It enables, you can see whether a login possible, whether a person has used a transaction start. The transaction start would signify whether a person has used a particular transaction or a report or other events, right? So SM20 will provide a comprehensive security audit logging that will show information about what are the system events, user login, log off, changes to system configurations, and security related events, right? And it is very much, we all should be aware that this is this transaction code, and what is more rather important about this transaction code is that this is not a log that is stored in SAP or within SAP. This is a log that is generated for transactions of SAP, not at SAP level, but at its operating system level. So that is one of the very most important integrity of this particular SM20 log, as opposed to the other logs, right? We saw one more log on SCU3 that is talking about what are the table changes that has happened. it is very much possible for a super admin to go delete the logs, right? But it is not possible for a super admin to delete SM20 logs. As such, nobody will have access to delete the line item of a log or by deleting a particular line item of a log. Rather than, it is still possible to delete the entire log of any application if a particular person has access. But it is very much important that we appreciate the fact that this is not a log that is stored within SAP, but it's stored in the underlying server, which can be accessed. Right? That is what is the left-hand side screenshot shows, the application server. Under which application server does this log store pertain to? Right? So this is one transaction. Now, second transaction code that we were talking about is SUIM. As we understand that, we were also looking at one similar business process in P2P, right? On people having access to release certain blocks in the system. Right? How does that happen? So people whoever has access to transaction code of MRBR will have access to release the block in the SAP system or release the block of that particular invoice from and process the payment for it. Now, how do you know who all has access to that transaction code? If you want to figure that out, we will have to go into a transaction code called SUIM that will showcase, that will have various options in SAP that will say user, whom do you want to select users by having access to so-and-so transaction code. You just have to enter the transaction code of SUIM and then navigate, and then you will get the list of all the users who are assigned with the transaction code access or any such access, right? Or there is also one of access where privileged or admin access. So you want to see who are the users having access to it. It is very much possible that you go into SUIM, generate that log, and see. Now, what happens? Now that we understand that a security audit log could be generated, and we could also very much use the user access management module of SAP through the transaction code SUIM to generate various accesses that people have in SAP, right? Now, as an auditor, although we focus more on the business process, right, on the business process as to what transactions have occurred, whether there is any data, it becomes very important that we also look into who has access to certain specific and critical transactions in SAP. So what are those specific and critical transactions in SAP? Considering the SAP's security architecture, right? The SAP is designed in such a way that there are various critical accesses in SAP. So these are the critical access along with their illustrative transaction code. I'm not going to say this is a complete transaction code, but this is an illustrative primary transaction code that is used to perform various related administrative access in SAP on access security module. So whenever we look at the general IT control, we always look at the SAP security or access security, and we also look at something called as a change management, change security. So here we will just try to quickly cover what are the transaction codes that are used in access security and what are the transaction codes used in change management process that as an auditor, we should just try to ensure that we are covering, right? The first one is on the security administrative access. What is a security administrative access? Security administrative access would mean how can you create a user normally? So how the users are created, how the users are basically administered, right? So this happens through a transaction code called TFCG. What this transaction code enables the user is to create certain new users or to create certain new roles, right? Today I have some new role called XYZ, and then we also will have some other role. I want to assign privileged access. And quickly, let me also answer one of the questions. How to view access at object ID level for users? That's a very good question, because that is possible through the transaction code of SUIM that we were seeing. So in case for others who do not understand what is normally an object or an authorization, right? So in SAP, the authorization or roles or profiles are configured at various levels. So the first is the T code. What we earlier saw is a transaction code, and transaction code will have a program, and program is the source code, right? To access this, what users will be assigned is something called a role right? Or a profile or a role, right? And once that profile is assigned, and profile will also be, the users will also be assigned with something called as a role in the system. And what the role will contain is authorization. So how do you think that SAP is going to prevent a user only from creating an entry and not from parking an entry and not posting an entry, right? If I'm having access to, say, expense module, I can create an expense, but I cannot approve the expense of mine. So how do you think SAP is handling? So all of these are done through a combination of roles, profiles, authorization objects and authorization values. Now, as we speak, there is a role, and for every role, there will be an authorization object. That authorization object will have a value attached to it. As we discussed, our value 01 will mean create, 02 will mean change, 03 will mean display only, 06 will mean delete. There are 44, 45. There are various different authorization values to it. So how do we get to view that object ID level is by going into transaction code SUIM and seeing, by using complex selection criteria and inputting the relevant parameters of which object that you want to see. Right? I'm just taking a quick, I was just going back to the Q&A because that is also very much relevant for our critical access point here, right? When we want to look at, people having access to create certain users or create roles, it is not only essential that we input PFCG, right? We should also input the activity level, 01 or 02 or whatever object level, if we know the specific object. Right? So that is very much important that we enter the right parameters. Although PFCG will give you large number of users, but there is a potential possibility that, certain users could be a false positive as well. That is one such very critical access that from SAP as an internal auditor that we should be aware of. And next, as we were looking at, is table update. So we were very happily going through SC16 transaction code to extract various data, various tables for testing our various controls across business process. But what if people can go to the backend, update the tables directly through SAP? That is one of the first and foremost risks that that is existent in SAP, and which is controlled through something called as a table access to update tables. With access to update tables, what happens is that is done through the transaction code, again SM30, SM31. These two transaction codes, you just enter the table and you will view the data sets in the table. And if you have sufficient permission, you will be able to modify the table value there. Now, this is a bit concerning to all of you as an internal auditor when you hear such statements, right? It's a bit concerning to everybody when people have access to directly go through the front end and then go through the back end and change any data that is possible, right? To prevent that, SAP also has something called as a client settings, which we will see later on in the upcoming slide, that by default prevents it. But anyways, there is still a possibility that people can, if the client is open, and people can still go and update tables in SAP. So this is a very important aspect that we should look at on updating the tables, because this is the fundamental basis which we rely or perform our business controls testing. Correct. And the next one is profile parameters. Now, what happens here in SAP is SAP's fundamental configuration of where to store your logs, or your configuration of your password parameters, or configuration of your single sign-on. Now, today I'm going to log into my SAP system without even having to enter the password of SAP. This is done through a single sign-on. So all that configurations are done through transaction code called RC10, RC11. Right. This transaction code paves the way for profile parameter, is what it's normally called in SAP's terminology. It paves the way for we accessing such profile parameters. So all these access should be restricted only to the basis administrator team, and not anyone outside the team should have such access to critical SAP functionalities. And next is access to batch jobs. So here I would like probably linkage to the previous question on the RFC user that a participant had. The reason why such entries takes place is, in SAP, there is a functionality, there is an option wherein I can use the privilege of another user to post an entry. If I have sufficient permission through SM36 and SM37, I can schedule a job in SAP that will run under the name of the privileged ID. I know the IT person. I know I have access to SM36. What I can do here in SAP is I can configure SAP to go and run a batch job in the name of a the IT person, and whatever entry that the IT person posts will come in. Whatever entry that I'm posting through that job will come under the name of that IT person, right? So that is also one of the risks of access to bad jobs. But however, there is a caveat. Normally, everyone will have access to execute bad jobs. If you have access to SAP, you can go to the parameter run and then click on execute in background. So whenever we execute in background, a job will be generated, job will be created. But access to bad jobs, access to execute jobs under a different ID is something that we are looking here, which is very critical, which should not be granted to any user. And last couple of points on access to execute programs and powerful profiles. So all along, we have been discussing on a transaction code. And before we started discussing, we also had a slide where we were looking through what is a program and how a program is driving a transaction code and all of this. In R2 and up to R3 came into picture, right? In SAP. SAP until 1997 had this concept only of programs. So unlike now how we enter the transaction codes, earlier in SAP, people used to enter the programs directly and execute the source code, which basically calls your ABAP program is nothing but your source code, which directly calls your ABAP program, and your other front-end module, the front-end GUI would follow. What this causes is kind of a security violation. You directly execute certain things, and there you will not have access to limit whether you are able to only post or you are able to only view it. That is not possible to be configured in SAP. So what that prompted is the invention of transaction code, right? The transaction code came in as an additional layer that will, instead of we directly calling the program, once you enter the transaction code, SAP will run a background check to see whether you are authorized to access it, and then grant you access to the underlying program. Now, with this invention, if people still have access to directly execute programs and modify the values or modify the transactions or execute transactions directly, that causes a add-on risk, which is why it is very important that we also understand who has access to directly execute programs, and none of this should be granted to anyone outside the profile, right? So all of these accesses that we have discussed till now are something that are very specific to a transaction code, like PFCG or SM30. But in SAP, there is a profile that is called as SAP_all or SAP_new. So what happens is, whenever a user is assigned with such profile, it is possible that the user, or it is very much evident that the user will have complete access to SAP, and he can do any activity in SAP possible, and there is no stopping of any activity at all. So that is the most powerful profile in SAP. And normally, no users will have access to SAP, or not even the IT people. IT administrators will have access to powerful profile, or rather it is not recommended to have the powerful profiles in SAP, but rather have the specific transactions. If a user is in the IT team is responsible for creating users, he can have the specific transaction code access along with the specific authorization objects and values, but not the access to the powerful profiles as such. So this is a very important aspect that we should all consider when we are looking at certain access security. And this is a quick Q&A. In SAP HANA, do we have any T codes or SE16 table to download end-to-end flows in all transaction levels separately for P2P? There is no specific process. As we are looking at universal journal is one thing that will have all the documents in place, but for P2P O2C process, there is no separate, we cannot extract it that way through the backend table at least. Right. Now, coming back to this critical access, so it becomes very important as an auditor that you appreciate that these are various accesses that are there in SAP, which we should be very well wary of, right? And next, now that we have looked at various access security from access management point, let's also look at some access, what could go wrong in changing system changes, right? That could happen, right? Now in change management, normally whenever a system is undergoing any change, right, it will go through a change management process. You will ask, you say, for example, you are a finance user. You would want to, probably have a report developed, or you want to modify the existing reports. Then in such case, what will happen is you will make a request to your IT, and IT will forward it to the developer team. They will develop it. They will show it to you whether you're happy or not. And then once you provide a sign off, they will implement in the production, you continue to use it. But in SAP, what is there is an option to develop directly in the production system. Now, what this happens is this will affect your integrity of the data that is there with such developer access directly being granted. Say, for example, if in my organizations, I have 500 people who use SAP or 1,000 people who use SAP, and a specific person is already using a particular report. And if I'm having access to develop, I go directly into the production system, I perform development activities that will affect the entire data integrity or data processing that currently happens, right? This will cause a massive system shutdown that will be triggered. And to avoid all of that, it is very much important that we do not grant access to develop in the production system. And this is controlled through the authorized. This is not controlled through any transaction code, because development is not governed through a single transaction code, because development is for the transaction code. Therefore, development is covered, is addressed through an authorization object called s_develop. So whenever a user is assigned with s_develop, he will have access to develop. Right? In ECC systems, we had a earlier concept of developer key. But in SAP S4 system, the concept of developer key is no longer existing, and any person having access to s_develop will by default have access to develop. Right? And the next important thing is access to client settings. So although all of these accesses that are listed in the slide, we might not find it directly relevant to our business processes that we have earlier seen, but what it affects is it directly affects the integrity of the data, as we were talking. Right? Access to client settings is one such very important functionality or security feature of SAP. Right? In every company code or every client in SAP, so SAP goes this way, right? There is an instance of SAP that will say, I have SAP instance of, say, PRD. Under that SAP instance, there will be multiple clients rolled out. One client could be, the default client would be there. There will be a production client. There will be a dummy client also being set up just for other purposes. There are multiple clients would be there. So one instance could have multiple clients. So what could happen is, whenever my client is set to no changes allowed, which means my client is opened, right? What allows is all the configurations. It is this. Imagine this client like our house door in our house, right? Whenever the house door is open, there is a house door, there is a room door, right? Whenever my room door is open, it is vulnerable to changes from inside the house. But whenever my house door is open, it is vulnerable. All the data that is there inside my system is vulnerable to change without even further notice. Right? All of your configurations through SPRO, all of your configurations, all of your data that you access through SE16, all of these are vulnerable to change when your client setting is set to open, or when your client settings in the other way is set to changes are allowed. Whenever you configure your SAP to say changes are allowed, which means that all of these changes in that particular production client or your system settings as a whole will be allowed for changes, and therefore any data that is storing or that is being stored within SAP is allowed to be changed. So this is a very important setting that we should be aware of. Although we might not find it so enticing to look at the initial level, but the repercussions of such settings could be so huge that even it could lead to modifications of your opinion as such, right? And that is one thing. And while we are looking at such client settings, and there is also one parameter that we were talking about, which is recording of all the changes, which is REC client, right? So that REC client is something that we should, REC client is something that we should also look at from the logging perspective. Only when the REC client parameter is turned on, the logging, all the table logging that you are looking at through SCU3 will be turned on. Else, that will not be. So this recording of client is specific to each and every client. That has to be set to the client value, and only when that is there, the logging will be enabled. And moving on to the next very important access to debug. Right? I can also find a related question, since the same authorization is involved, can we take it that all debug users will have development access and vice versa? No, let me brief that, right? So authorization, so I'm just giving here the authorization object of s_develop, but it also involves certain authorization values that needs to be assigned and other things, right? With the authorization object of s_develop with the value of debug, right? When these two are there and activity as 01 and 02, right? What happens is this will grant users with access to debug. So what is debug? So debug is something that, while I'm processing the data, the system, and something goes wrong, or my SAP is still not working, there is an issue. Now, normally this is debug is some mode that will normally go in during time of development, right? Where there will be a debugger who will debug what is wrong with the source code, and he will insert a break line, breakpoint, and ensure that up to what point that the source code is functioning, or things like that. Now, what happens in SAP is in the production system, it is possible for us to have a debug access. When we say debug access, I can go into the debug mode and then stop the processing at a specific point of time. Now, what this happens is, say, for example, I'm processing depreciation and I have debug access, and with a willful intention, what happens is I insert a breakpoint at a particular point and then say, okay, the depreciation posting stops here, and it will not go to the next asset class or asset category, right? So this kind of manipulation is possible with the access to debug. And this is very important that we also look into people who have access to debug and ensure that nobody has access to debug, because having access to debug is similar to having powerful profile, with only difference being you will need a technical knowledge, or the user will need, we have to be equipped with technical knowledge to perform these debug activities, right? And finally, import transport. Transport is nothing but making changes. Whenever a change originates from your development system, it has to be imported into production, and who has access to import that? This is also something that has to be restricted only to the business people or to the basis team, right? There is also another question: which report can tell who has access to production and development? See, okay, as we were entirely talking, right? These are two different systems on its own. Although it will be under the same common roof of SAP instance, the users are always created at the server level or at the client level rather, right? If you want access to the production client, you will be created as an access in production client. And if you want access to the development client, you will have to be created as a user there, or rather your access has to be assigned also there, right? Now, if you want to say who has access to production, who has access to development, you have to get the listing of users from both production and development, and then you have to compare it by comparing two reports, right? And I hope I also answered the authorization of the other another question on the commonality between the access to develop s_develop and the development with debug access. So debug access is a bit different. It does not grant access to develop directly, but only debug. But develop access to authorization object of s_develop with a combination of other values and activities will prompt the developmental activity to happen. So there is a bit of difference between development and debugging in the production system, right? And moving on to the next one, how does again SAP S/4? We have looked at the impact or changes in SAP S/4 in the business process, but how far these controls have been impacted in the as far as the IT controls are concerned, right? Now, when we look at the IT controls, now the first and foremost is the introduction of Fiori. Through introduction of Fiori, what has happened is there have been additional risks that have been introduced in the SAP S/4 system, right? Now, as we were talking about a classic example, now I might create an invoice from my GUI, and I will have access from my mobile phone itself through a simple role misconfiguration that could have such an impact in my new system. I could have approve access in my mobile, right? What this leads to is basically, one is that we should be aware of what are the conflicting roles that are there. So as an organization, it is very much recommended that we first identify what are the roles that don't go hand in hand. It is basically like a segregation of duty rule set. like, that we also have sufficient tools like, GRC and other tools that perform this function, right? And we have to ensure that these rules are being configured, are enabled, or rather or identified appropriately, which don't go hand in hand. And while we are doing this, we should also include the roles of Fiori. So Fiori roles are different from the roles of regular transaction code. Right? Normally, until ECC, there was not this additional add-on or additional consideration that we have to do. It's only that who has access to, say, create a material master through MM01. It is only that, right? But now, if I'm going to change that, then there is also a possibility of Fiori. Now I should look at one role of creating directly through SAP, another role of any possibility of performing some transactions through Fiori. So this rule set is something that we should be very wary of. And this is also following up with our access controls whenever we are using an existing, or whenever we are having any existing transactions. And SAP S4 has come up with not many new transactions, but at least a few transactions, and we should ensure that all of these accesses are being controlled. And whatever access that people get through mobile, the same access should also fall for people accessing the systems through their desktop as well. So all of these should go hand in hand, rather, right? And what it also calls for is, as we have discussed about Fiori, and there is also something called system landscape transformation, SLT, that facilitates all of your other process in relation to changes and systems management as such, right? We should consider those systems also in place, which were no longer in place until SAP ECC. And such interfaces of SLT and middleware applications should also be scoped in, or we should understand the new architecture of SAP S4, and which will have a significant impact on the way that controls operate in SAP ECC. Right. But also, this points out to very high level controls, right? What specifically could go wrong in other systems, right? I think we discussed pretty much on Fiori or control implications and SOD, and whenever the provisioning happens, that also should be taken care, and your SOD should also incorporate such. Now, these are certain specific changes that has happened in the general IT controls, or the IT controls in SAP from development access. While we were discussing on development, I think we also had stated that the concept of developer key. The concept of developer key was required until ECC. So ECC, how normally the transactions occurred is that once you want to develop some changes, the first you should have a developer key, which we should purchase or procure from SAP Marketplace. SAP Marketplace is a place where we purchase the licensing and purchase various other products from SAP. So we should purchase or procure the license from SAP Marketplace, and that will get automatically synced or downloaded to my SAP. And once I assign that key, developer key, in my production also, it will be there in my development server. But if I assign the developer key in production also, I will get access to the develop for that user with the developer authorization. But in SAP S4, this concept of SCCR, what normally they call of developer key and object key, is not required, and simply the development and production is controlled only through the SNS. And the next one is on the security policies, wherein S4 HANA allows for user-specific settings on SAP S4, and SAP nodes are no longer applicable, and Fiori some discussed as well. So any questions so far? I know that I've tried to answer all of the questions on the Q&A box, but I can see another question that is coming up. So how is inventory valuation done through SAP, and whether the rules as per Accounting Standard 2 have been adopted, as well as comparisons in our report? So see, this is again the adoption of your, or alignment of your controls or configurations or processes in line to your accounting standards or your company's policy, something that should be customized and depends on organization to organization. And inventory valuation is, I think we discussed on that, right? There are only two ways of possible of inventory valuation, and all of these are configured through their material masters that is there. And that is very well, that very much depends on the way that the organization customizes the SAP. And in SAP, we all should be aware. So whatever has been highlighted here are only standard features of SAP. So I've seen some clients wherein the customizations in SAP were more than the standard features in SAP, right? So that is very much possible in SAP. So SAP offers so much amount of customizations that can go in for, wherein we can afford to customize literally each and everything that happens in SAP. I want to create a new approval workflow. I can do anything with my SAP if I have one, the licensing, and two, the technical knowledge, or the consultants who have technical knowledge on SAP. So the customizations in SAP are very much possible. So anytime that we, as an internal auditor, we look into SAP, or we look into a process carried out in SAP, we should first try to understand how customized is this SAP? How customized does the business? How is this business process customized in SAP? I would suggest that be the starting point of any audit or any process understanding that we do. Because we might take certain standard transaction codes to the client, and then the client might give us some varied responses because they have customized a lot of other things, right? So that depends entirely on the way that customization made by the management, and we should also be very cognizant of that possibility of customizations that the organizations can do in SAP, right? I think we are currently at 800. So any questions I'm happy to take now.
Hello.
Harish, maybe we should close in the next 5 minutes. Any questions, guys? Thanks, Harish. I think you should have some more sessions. If you guys want interested, let us know. We will run some more sessions, no problem. But sticking on to time because there are the schedules to Harish and others. Thanks once again. So any questions? Can post it on chat. Any other offline questions? Please send it to the IA website, right? What is that link?
Yeah, digital. I will share that email ID also.
Just can you put it on that thing link only on the chat box?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
All the participants are allowed to
Harish?
talk.
Sorry, no?
All the participants are allowed to talk here.
Oh, great. Okay.
So Harish, you can answer all of them one by one.
Sure. So I think the presentation slides, yes, and authorization objects, I believe I have answered that. It does not, SNS code develop does not go with debug, and both are different accesses. And the appreciated session on Fiori and associated matters. Yes, Fiori again is a better topic on its own. So as Ravi was talking in the beginning, SAP itself is a topic for a good 3 or 4 full days because SAP, and then we still would not be contented with what SAP offers, right? We have tried to summarize on various pointers that is available in SAP, both from business process point of view and also from information technology and security point of view, just so that we are made aware of such things possible in SAP, right? So that is something. And
hi, one question is, since Fiori is also developed by SAP, how is it possible that there might be role-related conflicts between Fiori to SAP? Why is that onus to ensure that there are no SOD conflicts placed on the user? Because it is the same system that is configured behind both applications.
It's the same system that is configured, but the way that SAP has been defined or designed rather is that SAP Fiori goes by the way of something called tiles. So as some of you might have seen that SAP Fiori has a tile. Each time I click on a tile, it takes me to the transaction. So what happens in the back end is that once you click on a tile, it triggers or it calls for the transaction code in the main system, main SAP, and which in turn calls your the backend program. And what depends on organizations is, if you want to use Fiori, first is that you have to develop tiles and map those tiles to your transaction codes and programs. Now, what this means is that there should be a role. Just because I have access to the front-end T code does not mean I will have access to Fiori. Now, I need access to Fiori, through which I will also have access to the transaction code. So we are talking about two access here. One is access to Fiori. Fiori is kind of a mobile application, or a web-based application, web-based portal. Instead of we going through the cumbersome process of logging in to the GUI of the application, Fiori is facilitating an easy transfer through web or other systems through which we are trying to navigate. So the rules or the roles for Fiori is different from the roles in the SAP system as such.
Okay, so you say the differences extend beyond just the front end.
Yeah. That is the reason that people have the organizations configure roles separately for Fiori and separately for front end.
Okay, thanks.
And there's another question: is there a way?
Some more questions.
Yeah. Is there a way process mining can be done with stable timestamps? Any suggestions? So as I was also touching high level on one of the other points also on the continuous control monitoring, right? Process mining or data mining with a large amount of data coming into SAP on a day in, day out basis, right? It calls for data mining, data analytics in itself, right? And that is very much possible, wherein we can also tie back any tool. If we are using any, we can tie back, build some dashboards. That will be done on a continual basis. Also, that is also possible. And can you share some commonly used SAP reports useful for internal audit for each cycle? Yes. See, one thing is that, instead of we going by the SAP reports, one thing is the SAP reports can be hugely customized by organization. That is why I did not go to specific reports, but rather certain configurations or certain transaction codes in each of these business processes, right? Like a material, we would have some transaction codes called MB51 or MB5B that will provide you with all the material movements and all the other things. But rather, there is also, that is why I was trying to introduce the concept of SE16, which is a backend, this is a gateway that provides the access to a large amount of data warehouse itself. It's a repository of the data itself, master data and the transaction data. And yes, that I would suggest that we directly get it to ensure the data integrity also.
அந்த பக்கம் wire trailing கஷ்டமா இருக்கு.
Yeah, hi Harish, this is Loita here. Regarding the process mining question I had posed with you, could you suggest any specific manner where you can structure a process mine, code yourself with Python, so that rather than using the expensive tools out there in the market, you can just do it yourself?
See, that is also possible in case we have sufficient knowledge on SAP. So one thing that we need to understand is these SAPs, whatever I have now described, is only SAP standard tables. So as and when we start customizing SAP, we would end up with a lot of customized tables in SAP. So with such, if there are sufficient knowledge, if people have sufficient knowledge to go in for customize, it is very much possible to build an add-on using open source software. It's also available. Instead of you going in for licensed analytics tools or mining solutions, you can also develop an open source through which you can customize or you can build reports out of SAP as it. But that would require an extensive knowledge on on SAP and also on your the customizations in your specific organization itself. So that is also possible.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd.
This is Ramji here.
Hello, sir.
Many times when we come across SAP installations and all, we find that many of the subtables which are supposed to be properly done, configured, they do a shortcut, the implementation people, they do a lot of shortcuts. And then that results in a issue, which happens when the go live happens. They do shortcuts and then you find that the whole thing gets delayed, and then a lot of reconciliation you need to do from the go away at that point. So how do we ensure that whether all the tables have been properly populated? How do we do that? You know, there should be some way of ensuring that they have not done the shortcut.
That's a very good question on data migration. Again, data migration, see, what normally that we expect is, considering moving away from either from SAP, older version of SAP to SAP newer version, or from other application to any application for a matter. One is we have to look at some reconciliation control or certain management driven controls that will sort of ensure that if I had, say, 100 masters, 100 vendors or 1,000 vendors with so and so configuration, how is that getting migrated? Many times what happens is sometimes records of previous year will just be bundled and coming as a single line item, and then for the past 3 years or 4 years of data only will be pulled up. Right, so there are many shortcuts that people adopt for the time of migrations, or many practices that we normally wouldn't suggest that is currently being followed across migrations. I've also seen some cases where there have been incorrect migrations happened because of falsified program logic. The earlier system would consider X logic and the new system would consider Y logic, and instead of following some quantity or value, there was, say, earlier I had 100 liters of material. Now that has been translated into 100 kg of material, right? The valuation is the same, the unit of measurement alone differs. Now this is, although it might be a very small field, this will cause a huge repercussion. So how do we ensure that this does not happen? Is a proper and thorough post-migration, post-implementation review of data integrity. So I wouldn't say there is any shortcut to it, but rather it is all one of the most important risks that every organization faces is such kind of data migration whenever there is a migration of data involved. So that ensuring the data integrity becomes one of the most painful points also to ensure, and that is the most important thing. Right.
Another thing, we find that when entries are made, the proper T codes are not recorded and all that. So the whole thing sits somewhere. The amounts which should go somewhere, it doesn't go properly. So
Right.
Resulting in, sometimes it may affect inventory, sometimes it may affect assets, sometimes it may affect liability. All these issues are there. So ultimately, it may also affect, it may also result in tax, where there could be a tax evasion also, because tax authority will come and look at those points only.
That's very much the data migration. It's suggested that anytime a data migration happens, it is recommended that we do a proper and thorough review of the data that is migrated.
Harish, thanks once again. Thanks, folks, for attending us, slightly going beyond stage. We have a thing coming up in the next 15 minutes. Another session Harish has to start. So unfortunately, we run out of time. Great session, Harish. Thanks once again, IA members. And any questions, digital@iamadras.org is the website you go in. Just keep looking at the Madras website as well. With a lot of updates. There's going to be a launch of a LMS portal shortly. Learning management and registration might happen through the portal for more learnings. And any questions, happy feedback, happy to take once again. And great session, Harish, once again. And yeah, have a safe weekend. Thank you. Thanks, Saravanan, and thanks, Varsha, for the support.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ravi, for your support. Thank you, Saravanan, for all your support and help.